Welcome, everyone, to another Ask the Professionals. Very exciting to have one just before our wonderful event on the 21st of May called Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And we've got some amazing presenters with us today to talk about accessible events. I'm just going to start with an acknowledgement of country. I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm meeting here in Canberra, and pay respects to the elders, both past and present. And I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people in attendance today. Please share in the chat your name, where you're paying your respects from today. We'll be using the chat for questions. We actually go through for the hour and a half. Everyone else, we will share in the chat about halfway through if you want to have a stretch. And just a little bit about me, Bree Norton, I'm co-chair of OZeWAI. We are a Australian and Asia Pacific professional membership for digital accessibility professionals. We have some wonderful benefits for our members, and we run these free Ask Professional sessions. We try and run them monthly, but we have lots of really other exciting things on as well. We've just announced a couple of partnerships. One of them is with ABRA, which we had a free training of mobile accessibility, and we're putting out a survey if you're interested in more deep dive mobile accessibility training. We also have a wonderful partnership with Mutually for mentoring. So if you want to know more about that, it's actually for OZeWAI members. And our membership is as cheap as $50 a year. And special for those who are on the call today, and I'll mention it again at the end so everyone knows, is that those that join from this call, you will get your registration membership into the next year as well, just to cover for the 2 months that we have for the end of this year. So please consider joining OZeWAI, and you get some of the wonderful benefits that we are building for our membership professional organisation. So that's a little bit about OZeWAI. I am now going to hand it over to Ricky, who is going to moderate the session today. Thank you, Ricky. And we look forward to hearing more about how to make your events and meetups and workshops and training accessible. Thank you. Over to you, Ricky.
Thanks, Greg. First of all, my name's Ricky Onsman. I'm Principal Technical Writer at Vispero, Global Accessibility digital accessibility consultancy based in the US, but I live and work on the south coast of New South Wales from my home. And I'd like to welcome Julia, Jennison, and Rosie for today's session on accessible events. It's a pretty huge topic, but we're very fortunate to have three people who know a great deal about it. And I'd also encourage you all to put any questions you have for our panel into the chat. We'll try to pick them up as we go along, or we might do them in a bunch at the end of the session. We'll see how things go. So first of all, I might ask the panel to introduce themselves, maybe to say a little bit about your journey into digital accessibility, how you came to be here, what you focus on. We might start with Julia Spaganovic.
Thanks, Ricky. My name's Julia. I'm the Events and Marketing Coordinator at Intopia. Event organising is my jam, so I'm more on the event side than digital accessibility. I discovered I was really good at it when I started volunteering for a local speculative fiction and pop culture convention. Did that for 9 years, so I now have over 15 years of experience. I've done everything from trivia nights, movie fundraisers to 4-day conferences. I've also coordinated the Accessible and Inclusive Tourism Conference and ELICamp. I'm passionate about ensuring anyone who's excited about an event has the opportunity to attend and enjoy it. I also bring a lot of lived experience and expertise to my events.
That's fantastic. You've got such a depth of experience on this topic. We're going to be tapping right into that. Next, we might ask Jennison Asuncion to introduce himself.
Well, hello, everyone. I am Jennison. And I first of all want to say hello from San Jose, California. Happy to be joining you all. I am co-founder of Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which is coming up May 21st, as well as chair of the Global Accessibility Awareness Day Foundation. I have been involved in digital accessibility itself as a profession full time. This year actually marks my 20th year in the field. However, but prior to that, I did some academic research on accessibility and the use of technology by college-age students with disabilities. Um, and in terms of event planning and that kind of thing, I have been organizing accessibility events, particularly around digital accessibility events, since 2011, when I started Accessibility Camp in Toronto. But even prior to that, and I do that to this day, we're having the 11th Accessibility Camp here in the Bay Area on May 29th. If there's anyone watching or listening from this area, or people want an excuse to come out this way. So there's that. But then prior to that, in my college days, I was very involved in the disability student advocacy movement back in Canada. And we had an annual conference, and that was where I really got educated on just the different uh, needs from an in-person experience perspective of what's needed to make a conference fully inclusive. And then obviously, or not obviously, but as someone who is completely blind myself, I too have the lived experience of attending conferences and knowing what's worked for me and what could have been done better to make me feel more included as an attendee.
That's great. Thank you, Jennison. And last but by no means least, welcome to Rosie Putland.
Thanks so much, Ricky, and welcome everyone, and welcome to my fellow panel members. I'm so excited to be speaking on a panel with the two of you and with the wonderful Ricky moderating. Hi everyone, my name's Rosie and my pronouns are she, her. I'm based on the Northwest Coast here in Lutruwita, Tasmania, on the lands of the Palawa and Pakana people. I'm a proudly disabled person, like my other panelists, and so have lived experience of what it's like to go to some really inaccessible events, but also what it's like to go to some really accessible events as well. I have an energy limiting disability, which means I use different mobility aids on different days, and I'm also autistic. I am the co-founder of Modality Co, which is a digital accessibility social enterprise, and we mainly work with small businesses on improving their digital accessibility experiences for their customers. Shouldn't only be the big business that gets to have accessible experiences. It should be our small businesses as well. And I think that's where a lot of my passion comes from in accessible events as well. You don't need to have a massive budget to be able to have a really accessible event. In the last couple of years, I've been running an accessible event design training with the wonderful Sue Wickham from Sue Wickham Consulting. She has over 20 years of experience working in events. And so we sort of combined forces from the accessibility side and the lived experience side and the event design side to come together to create a training for organizations as well. And so that's been a real pleasure. And I also work in the disability advocacy space for children and young people with disability Australia, doing a lot of their comms and marketing as well. And I think like from the working on events experience, a lot of what I do in planning and designing events from the Tasmanian accessibility community is small events and how do you make events accessible with a really low budget. So I'm keen to be able to give some tips and advice on that in today's panel. So thank you so much.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Rosie. It's actually a very rare treat for us to have a panel where everybody has lived experience of disability. For the record, I have a hearing impairment, so we've pretty much got the bases covered. Okay, let's get stuck into the topic for today, which is about accessible events. And of course, when we're talking about accessible events, my intention is that this discussion should include live in-person events, but also online events, because it's important that they're accessible too. And I guess there's an added kind of frisson to this, which is that we'd like all events to be accessible, but there is a certain level of responsibility in that events that are about accessibility must be in themselves accessible. So I might begin with Jennison. Tell us a little bit about when you're accepted, the Global Accessibility Awareness Day endorses events around the world that focus on disability and accessibility. Do you take steps to ensure that people who register with you, that their events are accessible?
Right. So we So short answer to your question is we don't proactively ensure that everyone's events are accessible. We don't provide any formal endorsement. What we do provide is a place for people to list their events. We we have never and this is our 15th uh, running of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. We have never gotten feedback telling us that a particular event has not been accessible. That doesn't mean that there haven't been issues. We just haven't been made aware of them. But we expect, as you just mentioned, Ricky, there's an expectation that if someone is going to be running an event on accessibility, that steps will be taken to make them accessible. But as you can probably appreciate, there are hundreds of events
Yeah.
held around the world, and so for us to be able to monitor all of them or to make sure they're all doing right would be a huge undertaking. Now, all that said, you did give me pause to take note that one thing we should have on our website are a couple of resources, and there are some really good ones out there, by the way, to just have as reference points for people who might be doing an event for the first time. Because there might be some people who are running an event for the first time and who may not be thinking about the full range of people with a variety of different disabilities or impairments and how to make those events as inclusive as possible.
Yeah, that's a good answer, and it's a good point too. I suspect that during the course of this conversation, we're going to identify quite a few resources that anybody can draw on to help make their own events and other people's events accessible. I know that Bree has a document that she wants to add in the link as well, which is a kind of a checklist for accessible events. I might turn to you here, Julia, because you have a lot of experience with making events accessible and especially ones that focus on accessibility. And that's not just AliCamp, which is, for those who don't know, it's the absolute premier conference that focuses on accessibility in Australia. Huge event. I was very privileged to speak there last year, as was Jennison, which was fantastic.
Great
But
event.
it's a real gathering of the tribes for people interested in digital accessibility, particularly in this country. Um, can you talk us a little bit, Julia, about how you go about what sort of things do you assess for accessibility in an event like that?
Yeah, so there's a lot we do. And I like to broaden it out beyond accessibility into inclusiveness. So, of course, in addition to making sure things are accessible for a wide range of disability and access requirements, we also want people who are gender diverse or have chemical sensitivity or who are immunocompromised to also feel really welcome. So the biggest thing you can do is build in and plan for accessibility from the beginning, especially in your budget. Don't treat it as a lower priority. Don't treat it as a nice to have if we can, or an afterthought, because that is where it will cost you more. Um, the other biggest thing you can do is, and we do, is ask. When people register, we have a question in our checkout questions. Did you want to share any accessibility requirements? Is there anything we can help support you with to, attend and enjoy the conference? And then, of course, we have a list of things that we like to do. So, um, you know, easy and accessible information about the accessibility of the event, step-free access and usable accessible toilets. I say usable because there's a bigger variety of accessible toilets out there, and not all of them are useful for all people with accessibility needs.
Yeah.
You've got things like live captioning and Auslan interpreting, sensory or quiet room, people call it different things these days, catering to dietary requirements, ensuring catering is on tables that are wheelchair or accessible. Height is a big thing, or if people are of short stature, gender neutral toilets. We encourage people not to wear scents, like fragrances, and encourage them to use masks or stay home if unwell. Make sure your information is in accessible formats. Having places where service animals can go to the toilet or have water access. Give presenters resources on how to ensure their presentation is accessible. Yeah, the list goes on.
Yeah, that's a massive list right there. And it's, I mean, being the event that it is and what it focuses on, it's no surprise that you try to cover all the bases. But I think you make an excellent point too, that it's one thing to try to predict everything in advance and cover every accessibility option that's possible. But the smart thing to do is simply to ask people, what do you need? And that's something that, when you say it out loud, it's obvious, but it doesn't always occur to event organizers to just ask participants, speakers, attendees, what their particular accessibility needs might be. Have you come across any kind of people identifying needs in that way that you haven't been able to meet?
Thankfully, a lot of the needs are something that we've already catered for, which is
Yeah,
really good because we do have like an extensive list of what we do. And I do it for all events. I mean, accessibility events. Um, Obviously you're going to be held to a higher standard, but to me, a lot of these are just minimum accessibility requirements. Yeah, so and there will be times someone does come to you and go, hey, this isn't working, or I'm going to need this. And if you're not sure about it, you work with them on it and be really transparent. I think
right.
is
Yeah, yeah,
important because like as we know, accessibility is a journey. You're not going to get everything for everyone um, right sometimes. But I think just being open and transparent and asking when you don't know.
yeah, yeah. That's a really good point. I might throw it over to Rosie. When you organise your meetups, they are both in person and streamed live. Is that correct? So, what are the particular accessibility things that you've got to take into account there?
Yeah, Rosie speaking. Thanks, Ricky. I really want to build on what Julia was talking about, and I really think like the key thing to accessible events is it's an information game. The amount of information that we can provide to people up front, I think the more accessible your event is, even if that information is actually telling people that we can't quite make this work, or these are some of the
Right.
limitations of the venue or the limitations of the event or whatever it might be. I think for me personally, in my lived experience, and in what I've talked to a lot of people about, a lot of disabled folks or people who have access needs, is actually just being able to find the information that you need to know if the event is going to work for you. So much of the time, deciding to go to an event and you're on the event website and they say this event is a fully accessible event, and you're like, okay, what does that mean? I don't want to have to call the person to talk to them and try and explain what exactly it is that I need. Like having that information up front, even if it's to say the limitations, I think is so, so valuable, and providing
Yeah,
more information rather than less information about your venue or getting to your venue. I think so much for me is actually getting to the venue. How do I get there? What does the door look like? What are the transport options? What are the pickup options around it? So I think for me personally, I think a lot of people forget about that they're so focused on the inside venue and trying to make that accessible, which is really great and absolutely we should be focusing on it. But the accessibility of an event is about the journey to the event. Like it starts,
Sure.
we talk about it starting during the registration process, and it starts before the person actually gets there on the day. And so I always say to people, the more information you can provide, the better. Even if you have a really small event, even if your event, the venue isn't perfectly accessible, or there's an alternate arrangement or whatever it might be, providing that information up front, providing more photos, or videos or walkthroughs, or like it's that informational thing for me in terms of making events the most accessible that they can be. Going
Yeah.
back to your sort of original question, Ricky, about making events accessible when you have hybrid events, something I'm really passionate about. I don't want people to have to miss out because they can't be in the room for whatever reason. And I think even in small events, we often have rooms where there's like sort of like a microphone in the middle of the room, and if you're online, you can't really hear like what's going on
Right.
in person. You're missing sort of the cross conversation that's happening, and like the speaker's a little bit echoey. Like I've been to so many events like that, and so one thing that we were really working on is like, how do we solve this issue? Because it should be able to be just as good of an event for the people who are joining online as the people joining in person. And one of the things that we're really talked about is audio is a massive problem. And so one of the sort of cost-effective ways that we've been able to solve that is by actually having non-amplified external mics. So our speaker can have a lapel mic, so your little TikTok microphone that you might see people holding, they can have that clipped to them. It can be plugged into the computer, and we can have with our mic setup currently, we have 4 mics. We actually have holders for people. And so there can be multiple mics around the room so that people who are joining online still are able to have the best experience possible with that. And so that's a non-amplified situation. It's a fairly small meetup. We're not requiring amplified microphones for the space, but making sure that those people who are joining on Zoom are able to have the clearest audio possible, as well as a camera set up too. So that was something that we did a lot of trial and error on, and something we implement across all of our events, whether it be a small meetup group or whether it be a political branch meeting, and we're trying to make sure that we can have online and in person attendees having the same experience.
That's fantastic. There's so much to dig into there, and I think one of the great points you make there is that people who have their own definitions of what accessibility is, and it is not always all embracing. I was watching a video on LinkedIn this morning from a young woman in England who was supposed to be visiting a wheelchair accessible bathroom, and it had some guardrails, but she pointed out, and it was like the owners of the place must be very embarrassed because, for instance, she showed that when she wheels up to the mirror, all she could see was barely the top of her head. All they needed to do was have the mirror a little lower so that people in chairs could actually see themselves. And it was a checklist of things that you might think on the surface are accessible, but they're not. It's very interesting stuff. I think there too, I might go back to you, Jennison, with your extensive experience and history of organising events. How much do you end up being limited in the accessibility you can offer by a physical venue or a digital platform? And do you end up making choices to say, we're not going to use that venue because they don't have the right kind of access?
Right. No, absolutely. It's fortunately because I am in a large city, I do have a lot of choices. Um, that's not always the case in smaller venues, right? Where there might only be one or two places to hold events, and only one of them could be physically accessible, for example. So yes, certainly when I choose venues for example, accessibility camp, that absolutely has to have meet minimum requirements from a physical accessibility perspective. I mean, the other pieces that my other panelists have mentioned, you know, are all included, right? But just from a physical access perspective, making sure people can get to into the event venue, but also transportation. Um, I know one of my panelists had mentioned this before as well, but just being able to get to the venue,
Yeah.
because not everyone necessarily can afford to hop in a ride share. So they might need to have public transportation information, um, and all of that. So yes, so I have certainly not chosen venues because they did not meet uh, that smoke test, if you will. Now, when it comes to platforms for holding events online, certainly, one of the unintended consequences of COVID was, as you all may remember, all of us having to start figuring out how we were going to come together online. And certainly some platforms, um, like Teams, were a little further ahead in making their platform accessible, and others had to catch up. But here we are at the stage where we do have a number of the larger platforms that are accessible. So that does provide choice, because part of it is also, affordability. If you want to have a large online event, and you want to have all the features, those aren't necessarily all free. So figuring
Yeah.
out that balance, and making sure you have budgeted, if you need to upgrade your license so that you can have more seats, or that you have all of the features that will make that particular online or hybrid event as inclusive as possible.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And kind of spinning off from that, back to you, Julia. Do you have an impression that things have improved in the time that you've been working organizing events?
I guess the answer to this is always yes and no, in that
Hmm.
you see some improvement somewhere in some spaces and not in others. Look, I think anyone that's organized an in-person event knows finding the right venue is the hardest part of the whole job.
Yeah.
It's got to fit in your budget, it's got to have the layout you need. It, yeah, and then throw in all the accessibility requirements. Like, it ends up, even in Melbourne where I live, like there are hundreds of venues, but they end up being a very small pool when you take all that into consideration.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. And I might stay with you, Julia, because I want to ask about with your time at Get Aboutable. And Alley Camp is an event for people who have a commitment or a deep interest in digital accessibility. But the tourism conference that you were involved with, that had a much broader scope, didn't it? That it was not just for people with disabilities or working in digital accessibility.
Yeah, the Accessible and Inclusive Tourism Conference. So the acronym for that's ACAP, so I don't have to keep keep that mouthful of a thing. Um, that was trying to get the tourism industry on board into improving their accessibility. We I ran, so it was actually started during COVID. So it ran virtually for the first few years, and I had the privilege of bringing it into an in-person physical event for the first time. Um, we were lucky. The Queensland government at that time were really starting to focus, so we got a lot of assistance from Queensland for that. Sorry, I kind of lost the train of thought. What was the original question?
Um, just about organising events
Oh
that
yeah,
are not just for
not
people with
focus. Yeah.
disability or interested in it, but do you have a sense of that you're kind of almost advocating or evangelizing for accessibility at an event like that that focuses on inclusive tourism?
Absolutely, and that's one thing I did want to do with the conference was make it a prime example of how to put on an accessible event.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
we highlighted it. We made it as accessible as possible. I remember doing a lot of remote venue site tours because it wasn't easy for me to fly up to the Gold Coast where we decided to have it. And yeah, as Jenison said, you discount a lot of them because, you go, well, that's not going to work, or, that toilet is terrible, or, but yeah, so it's events are also a good way to bring people in and make them aware of accessibility and why that's so. I mean, the whole conference was basically why it's important and arguing the business case.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I spent some time working in marketing for Web Directions conferences, and that's a good example of one where the target audience is not focused on accessibility, but the organizer, John Alsop, has had a lifelong commitment to promoting accessibility. So he works it into both themes that were presented in presentations at the conference, but also making sure that the conference venue itself was accessible, because there would be some people with disabilities attending. And it was a deliberate strategy on our part to kind of open the eyes of people who were web creators but didn't really know much about accessibility, to use that event to open their eyes to what accessibility is and how important it is. So that's a purpose served in accessible events as well, that goes beyond just the people who already know about accessibility.
Yeah, and oh, sorry, can I just
go ahead.
pick up on something you said that people with disability attend these events. I think that's one thing that it's like anywhere. People with disability or access requirements will be attending your event, whether you know about it or not. So
Yeah.
to say, we often hear businesses and events say, oh, but people don't attend who have access requirements. It's like they do. You might just not know about them, but they will. Or you're missing out because you're missing out on a market that can't attend your event as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And Rosie, to pick up on Jenison's point about it's one thing to be based in San Francisco or Melbourne, where there is a lot of venue choice. You're in Northwest Tasmania, where there's not going to be a lot of venue choice. What's been your experience with kind of wrestling with accessibility issues? Again, both, virtually is one thing, but I'm thinking here more specifically of the physical venues.
Yeah, Rosie speaking. It's certainly tricky and poses new and interesting challenges in the ways that we think about venues. For the smaller venues, something we found really helpful is partnerships with community houses. Community houses, like if you haven't been to one before, like definitely check out your local community house or neighborhood house, see what they're up to because they're doing great stuff. But can be venues that are catering typically to lower socioeconomic communities as well. And we know, at least within our area, people with disability are falling into a lot of those categories. And so it's really vital for those community houses to be accessible, to cater to their group of people that they're supporting as well. And so we found that to be really great partnerships actually across Tasmania with community houses. And also they never have enough funding. So if you can, chip in some money to support them, it can be a really great venue that you're not only giving back to, but are giving back to you as well. And we find them to be really affordable and most of the time quite accessible as well. So that's something that we've really found. And then libraries are the other one that we always go to
Right.
as well, tend to have a bit more AV set up than a community house, although some community houses have got like some really spiffy stuff going on there. But yes, libraries are another one that I really like to go to as well, particularly the types of events that we're running. Often like we're wanting to create that welcoming vibe, and a library or a community house might be a place that people are more comfortable within or have been to before or are familiar with, so it can be really beneficial from that as well. But those are the two, I guess, for the smaller type events, and the regional events are usually available for us and quite accessible as well. We've found really great success in those, in Tasmania at least.
That's great. Yes, thank you. I've got a question now for that I'd like each of you to answer, because it'd be interesting to see any differences. When you go through this, is it all in your head or do you have a written checklist? Start with you, Julia.
Oh no, you definitely can't. Well, event organizing in general, you cannot wing. Event organizing relies on checklists, otherwise you miss. It's spinning plates virtually. So if you don't have checklists, things do not get done.
Yeah,
And also within that, having timelines when
yeah,
things you need to do by, especially if you're wanting to book Auslan interpreters in particular. Um, they are in high demand and short supply, so you need to book Auslan interpreters as soon as you can.
right. Yeah, yeah. What about you, Jennison? Do you have a physical checklist that you use?
I don't. And maybe it's just because my events might be smaller than the ones that Julia puts on, but accessibility camp to me, because I've been doing it since 2011 in different cities, there is, the checklist, if you will, there is one in my head, and it's the stuff Julia mentioned. Like, you got to get those interpreters right away as soon as you confirm the venue and the date, you book those interpreters right away. Food, you have to deal with that early as well. Catering, all of those things. So to me, it's kind of rinse and repeat type of thing on my end.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And what about you, Rosie?
Rosie speaking. I certainly have a venue inspection checklist that is a physical one that I will take with me if we're going to inspect a new venue about, yeah, and checking off all those things. You know, there's things that expand and collapse depending on the size and the shape and all of those sorts of things. But that's definitely a checklist that I use and a great resource that we have. That we use for people in training as well.
Right. Yeah, yeah. There's an interesting comment in the chat from Vitya from Visibility WA, who says it's essential to check the venue's AV setup when running a hybrid session. How is screen sharing configured for sighted attendees? Can they clearly see the presenter? Are they positioned so they're not standing in front of the projected content? Are captions enabled and visible to both in-person and online participants? All terrific points. And I think I wish Vitya was on the panel actually, because they've just been through the Perth Digital Accessibility Conference, switching from one venue that they've been using to another, largely to accommodate more people. But it would inevitably have meant that they had to check a whole bunch of different things all over again that they'd previously been comfortable with in a venue. You mentioned, Jennison, that your accessibility camps take place in different cities, that you have since 2011 held them in different places. Does that become a difficulty?
Right. I should provide context. The ones I directly have run have been the ones in Toronto and in the Bay Area, and I've helped organize ones in other cities. So for the ones that I have directly run, I've been fortunate that I've been able to largely stick to the same venues for periods of time, which makes the rinse and repeat piece that I mentioned before is, is so much easy because I know, for example, if I've used the venue for a few years, you know what to expect, you know what's there. You've learned maybe lessons from the first year that you use the venue, and you just carry them through years after that. Obviously, it becomes you have to pay much more attention if in situations where I have to change venues. Um, you have to go through the whole thing, as my colleagues have pointed out, uh, re-inspect the physical layout and all of those things. But yeah, for mine, they haven't been challenging just because I've been able to stick to the same venues for stretches of time. And then
Right,
for the ones where I'm just helping out in other cities, I've left the that heavy lifting piece to the people on the ground in those cities.
right, right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, that leads me to another question for each of you that I'd be interested in each of your perspectives on. which is you've kind of touched on it already, but I'd like to dig a bit deeper into, to some extent, you have to rely on third party support, whether that's from a physical venue or from digital platforms. How much do you have to negotiate with those kind of things? So I might start with you again, Julia. Just about how much do you actually have to like talk to a venue about, listen, we really need this to be in place?
A lot. I look from years of experience, not just event organizing, but my own just going out into the community as a wheelchair user. I don't trust what people tell me.
Right.
I have a great example of this. I was chair of the speculative fiction conference one year. So I had to get on stage because I had to like do the introduction and everything. They kept telling me they had a ramp. They kept telling me they had a ramp. The morning of the conference, yeah, no, there was no ramp. They had a little ramp they used at the front of the building to get people up the curb. And that's what we ended up using, and it was not overly safe.
Okay.
So even though it is something I had addressed with them for months and months, pretty much since we signed. Um, so yes, I research thoroughly, get everyone to research thoroughly, ask questions until you do get the answers you need. If you can't see things, like if just example of site visits, if you can't do that, remote walkthroughs, request videos, and talk to them and tell them what you do need. Um, so yeah, I hound people basically until
Right.
until I get what I need, because like there was even I was meeting a friend the other weekend, and a restaurant that I thought, oh, that looks great and really interesting. Put on its website, we are wheelchair accessible. So you went, great. They've thought about it, because you never see that on restaurant websites. They must have thought about it. This will be great. We get there. We're there a little bit before it opens, and the person comes out to put the outside tables on and basically just went, what do you mean? You've been told it's wheelchair accessible. Because there was a step up the front. We thought, oh, maybe they had a ramp. So
Right.
this is why I have trouble trusting people.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, that's
And
fair enough.
Ricky, similarly to what Julia was saying, so one of the other things outside of camp is I am one of the co-organizers of a local meetup group in the Bay Area as well, and we do like to use we do a mixture of virtual and in-person events. And for the in-person events, we like to go to different venues, but absolutely, when people volunteer. And it's great when people volunteer, they raise their hand to say, hey, we'd love to have you host your meetup. We definitely, my co-organizers and I definitely go through a full list of things. Uh, Not a physical checklist per se, like I said, but there's some non-negotiables, right, in terms of the physical accessibility of the event venue, restrooms, all of those things, getting into buildings, all of that kind of stuff. But we absolutely want to do that. And in terms of when I'm doing the camp, going back to the camp specifically, and we're using because that's a full day long event. We will absolutely do inspections ahead of time before we sign on the dotted line, if you will, or agree to using a venue. We'll do walkthroughs and ask questions, certainly about the what's deemed to be accessible and what's not.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And Rosie, do you find yourself negotiating accessibility with venues?
Yeah, certainly. I think similar to Julia's experience is that oftentimes it's worse when you're a presenter than when you're the one organizing the event, because you have spent that time negotiating and making it really clear, and you've talked to the person specifically. Even then, I'm such a stand for make sure you know how to run your own tech, because I just don't trust anyone with tech. Like, as long as I have someone in part of the team who knows how to run the tech, because people will tell you that they know how to run the Zoom or how to pin interpreters or whatever it might be. But when it comes to the day and they don't actually know how to do it, I think I always like to have the backup of someone who knows how to run the tech. But yeah, certainly as a presenter, many things have been promised to me that are going to happen. And then you get there and they're not there.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you're crying in the toilet at the venue, being like, how am I going to get through my part? Like, and I think so often people forget, as an attendee or as a presenter, like, that's the real impact, is that you get to the event and you can't be there. You go home. Like, certainly that's been the experience for me at some events, is that I have had to leave or had to leave early because of inaccessibility, or because the accessibility that's been promised and is not there on the day. And I think it's all very well and good to ask and say, you have a section on your form that says, what are your accessibility requirements? And sometimes you pour your heart out and put in really specifically all your requirements, and you never hear anything back from them. And so, like, for me, the biggest things around accessibility are information, but also the communication, as well, and making sure, as someone who's running an event, that you are communicating with the people who've had specific access requirements and confirming that you have actually met those. Because so many times you put something in the form and you never hear back from them again, and you're like, I'm just hoping that this is, like, it's going to be accessible when I get there. Like, should I
Yeah.
call them and check, is it going to be accessible? And so I think as event organizers, it's really important that communication side of things as well, to make sure we're keeping people up to date. And that's how usually I can be assured that they are actually listening, is that I'm kept up to date with what's going on, or even ask, like, hey, we don't have this specific thing, but we have this thing that might work. And so being able to, as a presenter or as an attendee, negotiate some of those things and have those conversations about it.
Yeah,
I
no,
think I
that's a
think
very good point. Yeah.
sorry, I was just going to say, I think Rosie brings up a really good point as well, that we shouldn't just be thinking about attendees when we're talking about accessibility. It's really important, whether it's your speakers or performers or whatever, is also make sure they've got their accessibility needs met and are comfortable and can participate as fully as they need to.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very good point about the tech side of stuff as well. I'm involved with WordPress Accessibility Day, which is a global online event, 24 hours, 24 talks. And I'm the Asia Pacific organizer. And that is one of the most complex organizing things I've ever been involved with. We have, for every single hour that it's on, we have a team of 2 tech admins, we have a moderator, we have someone who just liaises with the speaker, we have a green room that we invite the speakers to half an hour before their event to check their technical capabilities and whether their system can actually do everything they want. Last year we switched to pre-recorded videos to make sure that we weren't left in a position that we have been on one occasion during my shift, during the Australian friendly hours. A British presenter got her time zones mixed up and didn't show. So we had to have a sudden impromptu ask me anything of the available people who were there. I've watched the video of it, and it's not something I want to do ever again. So yeah, it's very good. But this also leads to Jennison, you mentioned it, but I'd like to hear each of your thoughts on it. What are the bottom lines? What are the absolute must-haves, cannot do without? Maybe you could start, Jennison. Just
Sure. Well,
expand a
I'll
little
just
on what you were saying there about what are the absolute must-haves.
right. I'll reiterate what I mentioned before from a physical accessibility perspective. Just and again, this is all going to be preaching to the choir in the audience here, but physical accessibility ramps, making sure things like, for example, in the seating, making sure if you have seats that you can actually move, if you will, to make sure that there's space in each of the rows or each alternating row for a wheelchair user to pop in. That wheelchair users shouldn't be relegated to one section. So if you have actual chairs that like stackable chairs, that you are intentional about that, making sure the restroom facilities are physically accessible. Um, that there's a quiet room if that's at all possible available, and the transportation, being able to get to the venue itself, that is possible again because you can't expect everyone will be able to drive to an event on their own or to afford to take a ride share. So public transportation availability is another thing. And then, of course, the stage or the presentation area itself, make sure that we don't have the experience that Julia, you talked about the stage with the ramp. So just those things. If there's a lectern, making sure that that is height adjustable. So just a whole myriad of those things. The tech stuff we've already talked about, making sure there's enough screens so that you can project your captioning off of a separate screen, and that sort of thing.
That's great. Rosie, what would you add to that? Anything?
Rosie speaking. The original question was tips for in-person accessibility, is that right?
Well, the question was really about what's your bottom line for
Yeah.
accessibility must-haves when you're
Yeah.
organizing an event?
Yeah. I think Jennison's really covered the basics there. I think something that I'm increasingly concerned about in events and making sure that I'm thinking about is COVID safety at events. You know, we are still in an ongoing pandemic. Not having COVID safe events means that, you know, we're limited in the speakers that and the participants that we can have at events as well. And so thinking about ventilation, thinking about air purifiers, different things like that, thinking about if we have presenters or attendees who will be masking during the event, what can we do to support them and make sure that the event is safe for them? Do we have a eating space that is outside, so that those people, if they are unmasking during lunch or whatever food time it is, making sure that they feel comfortable and safe to do that as well. And so, you know, it's something that I'm really is top of mind when I'm thinking about organizing events is and having a lot of immunocompromised friends and colleagues, and seeing how often they're excluded from being able to attend in-person events. It really makes me think about that going forward.
Yeah, yeah. Julia, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think I've covered a lot of it. Sort of my lengthy list before and Jennison. The other thing probably might be um, being aware of affordability of your event.
Right.
I know with Ali Camp we have discounts for people with disability and students or free tickets, and for people who are experiencing financial hardship as well. Um,
Yes.
because as we know, it's hard, especially for in-person events, to keep the prices low. But if you've got some alternatives, and I know I've seen other events sort of you can buy your ticket, but you can also either donate or buy a ticket for somebody else as well. So that's a really important thing to make sure
Yeah.
everyone sort of can attend.
Yes. Yes. One
Can
thing
I
that
can I
occurs to
jump
me.
in, Ricky?
Yeah, go ahead.
Um, Sorry, everyone. My husband is commenting in the chat. So if you're seeing Matthew Putland there, that's my husband, who is often at events. We're working together. But I just wanted to, his last comment there is about dining and considering distance between tables. And the reason that he's putting this here is the last time we went to a gala dinner, where I was up for an award, there was no way to get a rollator or any sort of mobility aid through the tables. Like the room was just absolutely jam-packed. And if you had any sort of mobility aid, you're a power chair user, you're a manual chair user, probably if you're blind, like trying to navigate through that, it was just basically impossible. And so you were just stuck at your table, unable to, like everyone else, go around and talk to other people on other tables as well. And you're really just segregated to sitting in your own spot once you finally got there after navigating all the way through all these people. And the particular venue had like this horrible carpet. And the chairs were just not able to be pushed in on the carpet. So no wonder everyone was leaving their chairs out because it was really hard to push them in on this carpet as well. So just wanted to give a little bit of context to that commentary.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I might throw into the conversation as well a comment from Luna and a similar theme that she went to an event yesterday, and regardless of the elevators that you had to take to get to the floor, there were also stairs that took you to the event area itself. It gave me pause and surprised me that it was set up like that. I went back to look at the event details, and there was no information about accessibility. The event was very supportive and amazing in so many ways, but it shows how much more can be done to make events accessible for everyone. And that also makes me think of guide dogs that are often, not taken into account at events. And it amazed me when I went to CSUN a couple of years ago that there were people with canes, people with guide dogs, people in wheelchairs, and there were like literally thousands of people at the event. And half of them were running down the hallways while looking at their phones, being completely unaware of people with disabilities who were the focus of the conference and their, safety concerns. It absolutely astonished me. But I guess that's also a thing where you can't really expect the organisers to do much about that other than to make information available about, be considerate about who is attending this conference. And that really is something that we've spoken about here as well. We've got a couple of other comments in here as well that I might add to the conversation so that we're all aware of it. Annette Ferguson says, social stories are good for people with disabilities to know what to expect. For example, loud noise, need to show you tickets or ID at a certain point. This is how the venue is set out, etc. That's a very good point as well.
I
Now there's a
certainly,
question. Yeah,
yeah.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as someone who is completely blind, I certainly appreciate it. And it's rare, but for certain conferences, when they do provide information, like descriptive information about the venue and such, and I know a lot of conferences have started to implement indoor wayfinding. And now these are very uh, typically conferences that are geared to an audience that will include people with disabilities. We're not yet at the stage where everyone would necessarily think about having those things, but there's a lot now that's being done to make these events much more accessible in terms of indoor, whether it's indoor navigation systems so that people can easily find conference rooms and that kind of thing as well. You also brought up the point, it was interesting about the CSUN, the CSUN conference and your observations. One of the things I think that they do well that I don't see happen a lot of different large conferences is that you can have a ribbons put on your conference badge that that direct people as to how to approach them.
Right.
People might not be as comfortable to be just walked up to and talked to or things like that. So I think it's like, some people will say like, please don't, I'm shy or yes, please come over. I don't remember the different categories of the ribbons, but there's a whole thing like they just I think Julia, I'm not sure if it was Julia who brought this up or Rosie, but just the idea is there's one thing about accessibility that we're focused a lot, but there's also the inclusion piece and making sure everyone feels included. And that might also mean just how to interact amongst ourselves as attendees with each other. Because just because all of us, or at least on this panel, have lived experience with disabilities, and there might be others. It doesn't necessarily mean we are all experts on every single disability or impairment that's out
Yeah,
there. So just understanding that, I think, is very important as well.
that's a very
Ricky,
good point. And just to follow up on your comment about the ribbons, Julia, that's something that Ali Camp does as well, isn't it?
yeah. So
Only with stickers.
I've been trying to find a really good term for it because the best I've come up with so far is the traffic light communication indicators,
Hmm.
which is a
Mhm.
mouthful. But they're basically they can be badges, they can be ribbons. Yeah, so Alley Camp last year we used three of them. So you've got um a color and a symbol as well going. Please don't approach me. I'm not comfortable talking to anyone. You've got a sort of yellowy orange one that is basically I'm happy talking more with people I know. Or you've got the big open, yep, here I am. I'd love to talk to people. Come and chat with me. Um, Ideally, you have them so they can be interchanged, especially if you're doing a more than one day conference. I first learned about these as different colored pegs. So they've come a long way. But yeah, as Jennison said, they're a great way to know whether you can openly approach people and if they're going to be comfortable. And if people aren't comfortable, then people aren't approaching them too. And they sort of have to get out of that conversation because they don't really want to talk to a stranger.
Yeah, 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 that's very true. There's a couple more comments that I'll read out as well. From Vitya again. Tech setup and physical accessibility of a venue is so important. Some venues still don't allow presenters to plug in their own computers, which is a real barrier for anyone using assistive technology. Presenters also often can't view the speaker notes on the venue's system, which creates another level of difficulty. These are essential details that AV teams should communicate up front so that presenters can prepare and so accessibility isn't compromised. Very good points indeed. And Annette adds, I went to a conference last year and there was an audio download available that explained the venue layout, how to get to the dog toilet area. It was so helpful. That's a terrific idea. Yeah. And it seems to me that, I mean, I asked earlier about are things improving? My impression is, having gone to a lot of conferences and been involved with organising, I think things are getting better. I think we're more aware of the needs of people with disability to attend all kinds of events. And I think we're expanding the definitions of disability and accessibility needs that are associated with disability. It seems to me only a few years ago that it was a very rare thing for any kind of conference to have a quiet room. And now it's become much more, yes, that's one of the things you must have. You have to have that kind of thing. So I think there is scope to say that we are getting better at it. Um, but it's also very interesting, I think, that it's become an area of professional attention. And all three of you are probably good examples of it's part of your job that you've got to address accessibility needs in that way. Do you each feel that this is something that, is it an add-on to your job, or do you see it as a fundamental plank of your job? Jennison, I'll start with you.
Well, insofar as, wearing my hat as an organizer of these types of events, it is just it's a part of it's an expected part of my job as an event organizer to really think about this.
Okay, yep. Rosie?
Rosie speaking. Yeah, I definitely think it's integral. You know, we talk about accessibility is everyone's responsibility, or like everyone should be involved in accessibility as well. You know, sometimes that can mean that accessibility becomes no one's responsibility.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think it's important that it is integral to at least some person's role. And then the way that that splays out across an event and across the way that we design events, I think is different to each, you know, little part of who's involved, whether it be third parties, whether it be security, whether it be caterers, whatever it might be. Everyone has a role to play within that.
Okay. And Julia, I think I know where your answer is going to go.
Yeah, obviously it's essential, and like you said, Ricky, I think event organizers are getting more aware and better at starting to include and increasingly include. I meant you know, I require a certain level of accessibility to attend everything. So to me, it's an actual non-negotiable. You got to have it because I've there've been events I can't go to, and I don't want other people to have that experience. So
Yeah.
for me, it's just part and parcel of event organizing.
Yeah. 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 That makes sense. We've got a comment here from Chady Ritherden. I saw a video about a new style of accessible toilet designed in Europe that allows people in wheelchairs that need extra support to go to the toilet. This means they can go to big events, sporting events, etc., with confidence that if they need to go to the toilet, they don't have to go home. I tagged the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre and was delighted to be told by them that they already have them installed. So that feels like progress being made.
Sorry, Ricky, can I talk to you a bit about this? Because I know what these are. So
Of
these are
course.
these are what are called changing places. Um, they basically have hoists and changing tables, and some of them have showers. Um, I am passionate about this because this is what I need to go out for. Until these existed, I either had to hold on or go home early. So these are a really important thing, and I'm excited to say they're popping up a lot more in Melbourne. So we'd love to see them keep popping up everywhere. MCEC, sorry, the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre got theirs last year, which is so exciting. Yeah, and so obviously not every venue is going to have them because they're quite costly. I know the Victorian government were doing grants for them, which is probably why there's a lot around now. So they're not going to be everywhere, but if you can find a venue that's within 5 to 10 minutes walking distance of one, um, people have that close. It's also why if events are happening at a hotel, especially conferences, I will stay there so I can have a toilet in the hotel room that I can use and not have to go too far, which not a consideration for everyone, but it's one of my personal accessibility needs.
Right.
So yeah, like I said, the big places may have them, but yeah, if you can find your local one, and yeah, like I said, 5-10 minutes walk to one, if you can have a venue there, it makes it so much easier.
Right. Yeah. Jennison, you're having trouble with the audio.
Correct.
Yeah, I'm hoping you can hear me. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the audio, and I'm not sure. It could be my internet provider, which will remain nameless. But just a heads up that it's not happening a lot, but I am getting a little bit of fade in and out.
Right. I'm not getting anything here. It's all solid and clear at my end. But if anybody else is experiencing that, please put a note in the chat and just let us know. I'm not sure we could do anything about it, but it might be interesting at least to see whether it's related to an individual's connection or something at our end. I guess other thing I wanted to bring up was, and it's related to both the bottom line and the negotiating. Are there situations where you're prepared to accept something less than perfect in order to get the event on? That you will accept, okay, we've got wheelchair access, we've got audio loops, but we can do without this. And are there particular types of accessibility options that you kind of say, look, we can live without that? Might start with you, Rosie.
Oh, such a tricky one,
It is.
Ricky. I think it really depends on the venue. It depends on what it is, and like I said before, I think communicating those limitations to people is the most important thing you can do, whatever the limitation of the venue. is as well. And so I don't know if there's like a one specific thing that I'm just going to kick off the list every time. But yeah, I think it's just it's so dependent on what the situation is. And I think the best thing you can do is communicate that with the attendees and communicate it with the specific attendee that might have that specific access need as well. I wanted to go back to Julia talking about changing places and talking about actually like booking a hotel room to stay there. One of the conferences that I've worked on before, instead of the like anyone who required a changing places, which wasn't available to be at that hotel, one of the things that the venue did was actually book an accessible room that could be used by anyone. So during the conference, they were given a key to that room so that they could go use that at any point in the conference rather than using the accessible bathroom, so that people had more privacy and more sort of safety to be able to do that as well without a changing places being there. So that was a really cool thing that I've seen a conference do before, was just actually booking a hotel room to have that available. And I think they did similarly. There wasn't a designated quiet room, and so they had a second hotel room that was booked and utilized as a quiet space as well. So sort of a cool thing that can be done if the venue isn't quite what you need it to be.
Ricky,
I
I wanted to address this in from a different perspective, because I also speak to people who are wanting to organize camps and things like that. And I tell them the number one thing you need to make sure to have is a budget, because that's we all want to provide accommodations, right? And we're all like, there's not going to be an argument about that. But one of the realities is sometimes accommodations are not inexpensive, and so you really need to make sure that if you are going to invest in an event, particularly if it's an event that's focused on accessibility, or that's focused on disability, that you really need to make sure you have a budget. Um, and also make sure that from an attendee perspective, that attendees, we always say, like, we ask folks to identify if they have particular accessibility needs by a certain date, because there's a two-way street here, right? Um, if you have a limited budget, you're going to do everything you can to make things available. I'm not sure how it is in Australia, but for example, a day of interpreting for a team of interpreters, for example, is not inexpensive. Now we're fortunate at the camps that that we the number one things that the costs, or when we get sponsorship money goes to, it's earmarked for ASL, or American Sign Language, here in
Right.
the US, and to make sure we have that interpretation, and to make sure we have real-time captioning. All of those things come with a cost, but we also, like I said, we make it clear that people need to identify their needs ahead of time, so that we can budget for that as soon as we can. And so, like I said, to your question, I think the part of what's going to dictate, what's possible, is what funds are available, because not everyone has access to sponsorship money. Not everyone has access to multiple physical venues to choose from. Like Rosie was talking about, where you are in Tasmania. So it's just it's you know it's an interesting topic, but there's some practical realities, right? As much as we are
Yeah.
all advocates and care deeply, there's some practical realities that need to be just put forward, right?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I can think of examples for that. I mean, there's no point in investing extra money to rent a room that has an audio loop if you know for 100% certain that nobody with a hearing aid is going to be attending. There are some things that I think you would do as a matter of course, like provide visual sign language, because the event is going to be recorded, and people watching the event there will be deaf people watching it who know sign language. But there are bound to be some elements that you can, because of who's attending, that you don't need to make a serious investment in. I might just catch up with a couple of comments and questions from the chat. Chady asks, she says the panelists spoke of accessibility checklists to assess venues they want to use for events. Do they have any advice for an online resource people can use? And I would add that if anybody attending here today has any particular links to resources, chuck them into the chat so that we all have access to them. But let's just quickly go through. Do you have any resources you can share that act as checklists? Julia.
If I
sorry.
could, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
go
sorry,
ahead, Jennison.
No. Sorry about that. That might have been my audio fade. But definitely, Dreamforce is a big conference that the Salesforce puts on every year, and they have, if you use your favorite search engine, they have actually put their conference resources on how they make their conference accessible.
Okay.
I am 99% sure that it is online and available for folks. And also, I'll just mention the Web Accessibility Initiative has some great resources for making sure
True.
presentations are accessible. And I certainly share that for speakers who are presenting at my events because not everyone will have had the experience of presenting to an audience that would include people with disabilities or impairments. So you've got to meet people where they're at, right? We can't make these broad assumptions. Well, if you're coming to speak at an accessibility conference, of course you're going to know everything. So
Yeah.
that's something. So those are two resources I'll point to right away.
That's great. Thank you for that. Julia, do you have anything you can share as a resource?
I think Jennison's covered it really. My checklist has basically come from my experience over the years and talking to different people. But yeah, as Jennison said, if your favorite search engine, there's quite a few places out there that have checklists. I also want to quickly pick up. We know some of the things do come at quite a cost for accessibility. In Australia, there's a grant called the National Disability Conference Initiative that is put out annually, and you can apply for up to $10,000. We were lucky to get it for Alley Camp last year, and that helped us put in some equipment in the sensory room, helped us cover some costs for people, different things. So, it's worth checking what sort of funding and grants are around as well in your area.
That's a very good point. Yeah. And Rosie, do you have any links to a resource you can share?
Rosie speaking. I just shared the one from AdSet in the chat, which I really love, and particularly it is a little bit focused on unis and sort of education institutions, but I think there's a lot of things that are really applicable. So I love to send people to that one. And yeah, definitely echo Julia's point around looking for grants as well. I know, and even looking for grants around your city councils as well. I know in Tasmania, Hobart City Council often puts out some grants around accessible events as well and running them too. So yeah, definitely have a look, either state-based or nationally, or even your local council.
Right. Yep. Now there was another thing I wanted to read out from the chat, going back to a comment from Luna. Working in consulting and corporate, I've found it sometimes hard to include accessibility into the scope other than me checking for contrast scores and hoping the end product will have the right meta descriptions for screen readers. I've tried to bring up the laws around accessibility, but some just brush it off as an extra cost. Are there any resources on how to make a business case to include accessibility as part of the scope other than wiggling it in the process in a minimal way? This probably applies to digital and events. What do our panel think of that? Jennison, do you have any comment on that? I mean, we've talked a little bit about the grants there, and I think that is one area that might be able to do that to alleviate the cost aspect of it. But how do you make a business case for making events accessible?
Oh boy, you got me there. Yeah, I'm going to defer to my panelists, my fellow panelists on this one as I think about
Sure,
that for a minute.
sure, no worries. Julia, your thoughts?
I mean, this is the universal problem we have with accessibility, right? Is getting leadership and the decision makers on board. Um, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I can find some resources that maybe Bree can share later because there are a couple going around. But yeah, this is everyone's issue. I don't think it matters which industry it is. It's getting that buy-in from people who control the money. I mean, and the easiest case is what 20% ish, depending where you are, of people have disabilities. So there's a bigger market you're missing out on. Odds are there are going to be people with disabilities or access requirements at your event. There is definitely more data out there, and yeah, I'm happy to find that and pass that on.
Yeah,
Not
sure.
not not weird at all, Luna. It's something everybody struggles with.
Yes, yes, that's right. Anything you'd like to add to that, Rosie?
Yeah, Rosie speaking. There's sort of 2 points that I have. I never love to go with the fear tactic, but sometimes it does work. Particularly if, it's a public event, and talking about some of the risks around people with disability speaking out and publishing things online. I don't know whether you saw recently the little bit of a PR disaster with Adelaide Airport. There's a great video from an amazing disability advocate, Shane, who's a wheelchair user, and he was trying to get picked up from the accessible pickup zone at the airport. And his mum wasn't allowed to come pick him up from that zone because she didn't have a disability like placard. And so there was just some really bizarre rule around it. Yes, quite a few people have seen it in the chat. And he
Yeah,
loves to film lots of these sorts of interactions. And so he filmed this interaction and it's gone viral. And Adelaide Airport's absolutely copying a lot of flack, as they should, for this just really terrible process that they've got going on. And so, like, I never love to go with that sort of yeah, but it is a risk. It's a public relations risk when disabled people rightly call out the inaccessibility of events. And so perceiving not having an accessible event as a risk, for a financial risk, a publicity risk, thinking about it from that perspective can sometimes help get the right sort of people on board. The other thing I often tell event organizers, especially if they have sort of a yearly event or whatever it might be, is to pick one thing and make a commitment to that over many years. So it can be really tricky, and I think it makes it difficult in the business case. I've heard of a conference. They had a quiet room, and then they were like, "Oh, well, no one used it, so maybe we shouldn't have it next year." And it's like, no, like you've got to make a commitment to it over years, because people can learn that yes, this is a safe event. They're committed to accessibility. Maybe they saw that there was a quiet room available this year, and that might make them want to go
yeah, yeah,
in the future because they know that there's going to be a quiet room available. Or for so many people who might utilize a quiet room, just as an example, is that might make it actually accessible for them to attend the event, even if they don't use the quiet room. Knowing that it's available there if they need it as an option, meant that those people could attend the event even if they didn't access it. And this particular instance was like a large festival that had a quiet room available. And so I often talk to people about, when if this is the first thing they're ever doing in accessibility, is pick something and make a commitment to it over a period of time, rather than just sort of doing it one off and then going, oh, well, no one used it, so we won't do it again. And so I think that can be tricky. In the business case. And Georgia just said like it's a risk to reputation, but also positive reputation for organizations if they're supportive and inclusive. And I 100% agree. Like people with disability in the community, we talk to each other and we talk about the events that are accessible and supportive, and we talk about the events that are not accessible and supportive as well. And so,
Yeah.
in the example of having a quiet room, people might talk about that, and then the next year that trust is built. And I know that's can be very similar in the deaf community as well, like having Auslan interpret in Australia, at least having Auslan interpretation. There needs to be a period of time that people can build trust with that event or organization, that that's going to be delivered in a safe and inclusive way. And so, yeah, but when we find an event we love, don't worry, you're going to hear about it from a good way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I thought it was very interesting that Adelaide Airport's response to that situation with the parking pickup was that their procedures do actually have flexibility built in, and the person exercising that authority should have allowed this to happen because he had the opportunity to do so. And my response to that is, well, why didn't they educate him better? To exercise that authority in a flexible way. So I don't think they can shirk their responsibility that way. Say, load it all on the guy who said, no, you can't park here. So yes. Okay, we're actually getting very close to the end of the session here, and there are a couple of other comments that I saw and questions going by. One from Chady. I have a question for Rosie as an organizer for the Tassie networking group. What can meetup networking groups do to cater to people who are deaf? Stephanie said Auslan interpreters need to be booked in advance. I assume they're not cheap. What are achievable solutions networking groups can provide to be inclusive?
Rosie speaking. Yeah, it's certainly a tricky one, and particularly if you're wanting to provide Auslan interpretation, or people require that as well. Yes, looking for those grants, and particularly the local grants, I think can be a really great one. And like talking to the person and talking about what options are there for them. So, making sure that you're providing captions on the screen in the room, and also looking at other options for captions that can be on someone's personal device as well. I would say reaching out to your local deaf organization and talking to them as well. I know, I think it might be Deaf Connect actually have some grants available through there to make events accessible and pre-recorded stuff accessible as well. So reaching out to your local organization, having a chat with them about, hey, this is what we're doing. We really would like to make this accessible, trying to find those ways that you can work that maybe it's not a monetary cost, but or there might be a grant or something that you can use, and looking into that and developing even a relationship with your local interpreter as well. Ben Richardson is the number one interpreter in Tas that everyone picks up. So having a relationship with him can make it easier to pick up the sort of those last minute things as well, and figure out sort of pricing and stuff like that as well. So yeah, definitely getting in touch and having those connections, and making people aware of what you're doing as well is really important within that.
Right, yeah. Annette Ferguson has a question around it's one thing to offer the opportunity for people to express their accessibility needs, but some people are not particularly comfortable with expressing their needs or identifying themselves as having a disability that they have an accessibility need for. Does the panel have any tips on how to get people to fill in the "what are your accessibility needs" questions? Might start with you, Jennison.
Um, Honestly, from my perspective, like that's a tricky one because you can't you can't force someone to do it, so you can't make it a required field. Um, I think a lot of it, at that point, I I would argue that that's one of those situations where there's only so much I can do. I can't predict every single need and every single requirement. And so I'm looking to that person to if it's that important to them that an accessibility that event is made to be accessible. At that point, I need them to help me by expressing it. There's no other way for me to put it. Like that,
Yeah.
I can't like put in large writing or like please you need to tell us. Like we have to expect a certain level of understanding that we cannot predict who's going to need what. There are some like again we've already talked about the non-negotiables and the things we know about, but that if there are very unique circumstances and situations, we really do need people to be comfortable enough to at least indicate, hey, like could you get in touch with me so I can discuss my requirement? Maybe they don't want to put it on the form itself, but maybe they'd be open to having a conversation about it. But outside
Yeah.
of that, I don't have a golden bullet solution to dealing with that.
Sure. Julia, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think some of it is building trust, like Rosie was talking about before. I think it's if by doing accessibility things you are showing that you are welcoming and friendly and couching it in language. So I've changed the way we ask. It's not like just tell us tell us your accessibility requirements, or do you have accessibility requirements? It's like, please share ways we can support you, or if you have any requirements. So rather than making it because I think a lot of the times, people with disability and access requirements, so much falls on them to do the heavy lifting. And so you're wanting to take as much of that off them, but if you provide them a space where they can let you know, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's actually made me think whether I need to add a little bit more to that. The question we put in our registration checkout is to whether we just say we keep this confidential and it's only so we can make sure you can participate in the event. But yeah, I think that's when, as Jensen said, you can't make people do things. It's just providing a supportive and comfortable enough environment that they want to do that.
Yes. Yeah. I would add to that I mean, I have had a hearing impairment my whole life. I started wearing a hearing aid a couple of years ago, and it was an absolute revelation. I could hear things again, you know, but I'd never previously identified as a person with a hearing impairment. It's just that I said what a lot. Look, we've actually come to the end of this session. I want to thank all three of our panelists for fantastic contributions. It's been an excellent session. I really enjoyed chatting with all of you. And I'll pass it at this point back to Bree to wrap things up.
Oh, look, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Jennison. Thank you, Rosie and Julia. We've had you on before. It's just been wonderful. Jennison, would love to have you back at any time. Love to support you over here in Australia and what you're doing. And don't forget, everyone, check out GAAD, see what's on locally in Australia or online. Ricky,
Accessibility.day.
yeah, accessibility.day. Excellent. And Ricky, wonderful moderating. Thank you. You coordinated between so many of our own questions that we've had gathered for a while, and also from the amazing people that have joined the call. I've actually put a lot of the OZeWAI details in the chat, but the main one I just wanted to remind people, join from today, 1st of May, and you are covered till for the next financial year. And you will get the members' benefits that come into the renewal time that's usually 1st of July. So please support OZeWAI, support what we're doing here. We also can help you in maybe some of your local webinar and events. We love to partner with those, not just the ones with Web Directions and Perth Accessibility Camp. We love to partner with a lot of them. Reach out to us, see how we can help. Maybe it's through our contacts or maybe even some of the sponsorship partnerships and the grant support that we can help provide. We're all volunteers, but we all do this out of our passion and our love. And I thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for the panelists. A round of applause for everyone. And I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you.